This is the European edition of Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. We bring you the European unicorns, startups, founders, regulators, and leaders innovating the rapidly evolving fintech scene today. A truly localized podcast with both English and local language content, with some of the world's most well-known hosts and influencers in the fintech sector globally. Join us every week as we explore what makes the European Union a phenomenal proving ground for many of the fastest growing fintech plays in the world today. Okay, let's roll.
Hey guys, welcome back to Breaking Banks Europe. My name is Matteo Rizzi. I'm the executive producer of the show. Today I am with Meaghan Johnson. Meaghan, welcome.
Thank you, Matteo. Hello, everyone.
So today, as you know, the format that we are using is called Outside In, which means that we are interviewing notable experts in fintech with a huge background that are either Europeans or have an extensive European experience, but they happen to live in another side of the world, so they can give a perspective about what is it to make business on that side, how do they see Europe from there. And our first guest, I will actually let Meaghan to introduce it. I'll just, it has worked with, some of the biggest name of the fintech space. Meaghan, why don't you introduce Garrett for us?
Great. Thank you, Matteo. So our first guest is kind of a fellow Berliner, not really for too much longer, but at the moment, Gerrit Glass, who is head of banking at Nomad.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So, Garrett, we have so many things to ask you because your experience is just absolutely fantastic. I think, coming out of the Berlin fintech scene and now, launching stuff in Brazil. So, maybe if you can just introduce yourself, what you're doing at Nomad in the moment, just maybe share your experience before Nomad.
Yeah, I joined recently Nomad, which is the first digital bank in the United States that offering financial products to non-resident people. So our main target group is mass affluents in Brazil. And we built actually a digital banking solution so that Brazilians who won't have money in the US, who have a dollar account and also want to invest in the financial market in America, get access to this market, which is currently not able to access digitally and also not for the mass market. It's only privileged for super rich people. The company is actually founded by Brazilians located in Brazil, but we also have an office in the Silicon Valley. And why and how did I come to Brazil? So actually, in my former role, I was a part of the international expansion team of N26. So when I joined, we were live at 23 markets in Europe. We're up to launch the US. And with the funding round at this time, the founders and investors make the decision to grow globally and really become the first global bank. And for this, they needed a team, and I joined the international expansion team at this time. We made the first strategy, and it was not clear for me at this time where to go next. And after a strategy project, we decided that Brazil will be the next market. And together with a colleague, I came from Berlin to Brazil to set up the local entity in Brazil. So we hired a local team, we hired a general manager. We applied for a local license. We did a lot of research also to see how to adjust the local product. We selected different partners, set up the infrastructure, and prepared the market launch. But during my role, so I was from the expansion team from the headquarters. We set up a team locally in Brazil. It was time for me somehow to go back to Europe from an N26 perspective for focusing on new strategic projects. And actually I just started to enjoy Brazil also from a business perspective. So I decided for myself, I see my future in the midterm, at least in Brazil. And thus I left N26 and joined Nomad to keep on going with the experience there. Maybe just to add, before this, I was in the business development of FinLeap, the biggest fintech company built in Europe, where, for instance, Solaris Bank, Penta, and many more Fintechs are portfolio companies, and I started my professional career in strategy consulting for banks with PwC.
Gerrit, there is a sort of a traditional question today. Of course, it's outside in, and is outside in Latin America, and I forgot to mention at the beginning. And the traditional question we'll ask all our guests is, how does it feel as an European, with a huge sort of European background, FinLib, and then number 26 is, very much of European culture. How does it feel to build business, abroad, especially for a community that, I suppose that you had to learn, right? The Brazilians are, I live in Portugal, I know them a little bit, but they are a very specific sort of cultural affinity with financial services. Actually, curiously enough, not later than today, I saw a sort of a ranking of the best bank in Brazil, and out of the first 5, 3 of them are digital, and the Bradesco and the Itaú are like very low, it was actually someone, I think it was Bruno Dinicio, one of the fellow FinTech friends, that published this on his Instagram. And I said, hey, what a coincidence. We're just going to talk about this later on. So what's your take on this, Garrett?
So maybe first from a cultural perspective. So of course it was a kind of a change, and it took some time to understand better the Brazilian culture. And of course it's maybe not that straight and structured as maybe I'm used to know it from a German perspective. But on the other side, as you mentioned, with FinLib, we had more than 30 different nationalities in our company, and 26 has more than 40 or 50 different nationalities. So especially the Berlin startup environment, you're kind of used to work in different cultures together with Asians, with Americans, with Africans, with South Americans. So it was not too surprising, but of course, doing business with them, we got used to it. And also there, maybe even if it's the Christian values that are at least same. So I would even compare it somehow to same like with Spanish, Italian, or Southern European cultures, more or less. So it was new, but not super changing comparing maybe if I would have gone to South Korea or China even. And regarding the digital banks in Brazil, so what was for me really surprising was on the one side, the oligopoly of the big banks. So if you compare the Brazilian banking market with the kind of fragmented European banking market, there are just 5 big players that kind of asset or manage like 80 to 90% of the assets. So there's a strong power of them, and which kind of brought them in the position that they don't have to care too much about the customer needs, because all of the customers are somehow with one of these banks. So there was not too much pressure. And then when Nubank and also some other banks like also Banco Inter, Neon, Next, and so on, C6 is coming now, started entering the market. Of course, the new banks like Nubank focused on low prices. So the big banks, they are charging crazy fees. No one understands this. Everyone thinks that the bank want to take money from the people, and they don't really trust them. And then some, even you could call them heroes for some of the customers. So there's at least a lot of love towards Nubank. So they started to trust. They saw the product is nice, the user experience is better, and even the fees are more transparent and lower. So I think in the last years, the digital banks make a really successful in attracting customers and solving actually their pain points.
So that, I think, sets you up quite nicely with the launch of Nomad. If I think digital banking is so kind of ingrained, and, it seems to be that people are quite familiar. So I want to ask a few questions about Nomad. So, are you looking to be a secondary account to Brazilians, or kind of is the play more to be the main bank account?
No, for sure we are not the main and daily account. So what makes Nomad special, and thus we are not in direct competition neither with the American banks nor with the Brazilian banks, because we kind of distinguish the product is in the US, but the customers in Brazil. So we have different target groups. One main target group is the travelers. So for people who don't know the Brazilian environment, also there, not only the banks take a lot of fees, even the state or the government. So if you use a Brazilian credit card abroad, they charge the customer 6.38% on the transaction volume.
Wow.
Plus banks take a markup on the FX, another fee. So probably as a Brazilian going to the US or Euro paying with their Itaú, Santander, Bradesco card, they have to pay around about 8% end to end, which is of course super high. So one focus of us is to provide a US dollar MasterCard to the customer where they don't have to pay these so-called financial transaction tax or IOF.
Yep.
This is, I think, a huge target group and a good case. The second target is more the investment side. So the financial market in Brazil, if you look also on the big stocks index, is mainly driven by agriculture, by banks and some construction oil companies. So not that diversified as other markets. And there are a lot of people who trust the American companies or want to invest also in American markets or markets outside of Brazil. And for them, we are offering investment portfolios to also invest in the American stocks.
So, Gerrit, I actually have a question. Thanks to the fact that I'm pretty sure that you are also a number 26 clients, right? I would assume at least,
sure.
or maybe you you certainly used to be one of them. I put it this way. So, do you think that how do you see the challenges, in the US in this case, or like South America, because of the market that you're serving, compared with the European one, as far as the attention, the focus is concerned? Is like customers always at the center? Like, are the solutions comparable, or do you see some nuances between the two markets and the way they address the client's needs?
Yeah, for sure. So was actually also very surprisingly for me when I started to come to Brazil to understand more the market, the needs and this stuff. So I would say we are kind of, on one side, the good thing for digital challenger banks in Europe is they have to be creative in terms of actually creating revenues or generating revenues, because you have kind of a zero interest market. You don't earn a lot of money on a credit side. The interchange is kept on the card transactions, and not too many digital banks are in the investment side so far. So in general, it's hard to make revenues in Europe, and in Brazil, it's kind of the opposite. So there, the average interest rate, just giving an example, the overdraft product in Germany is around about 9 to 12% per year on an overdraft loan. In Brazil, you pay 9 to 15% per month, which is with compounded interest rate like 300%. So it's not, of course, was also not the idea of N26 to take a lot of interest on the market, but it shows at least there's a way higher market potential also in terms of revenues. Same for the interchange, which is 3 to 6 times higher in Brazil currently than in Europe. So on the one side, what I wanted to say is that if you are kind of successful in generating already revenues in Europe, as N26 did, it's even more promising to them to go to new markets. On the other side, the customer behavior was kind of totally different. So while N26 was or is very successful with their debit card, and also almost all of the digital banks just offering debit cards, Brazilians and also Americans, what I understood, love credit cards. So while, for instance, me coming from Germany, a German guy likes to have control over their money. They want to see what they have on their account, if they have enough money to spend it. What we saw in Brazil, and also what research shows, that Brazilians don't mind too much if they have it. They just want to pay it, and if it's possible, they do it. And maybe next month they have an issue, but they don't want to plan it. They rather want to have the ability to spend, because they maybe plan not so much, or just want to spend what they're allowed to do, because next month the credit market might be different. And therefore we had really to change also the approach, and to think about how we can adjust the product to make it successful in Brazil. For instance, everyone actually use it from the potential customer said us, with a debit card you would never become successful in Brazil.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think from my background, having grown up in the US, lived in the UK, and now in Germany, it's like the US is on the total opposite of the end of the spectrum with credit compared to what I've seen in Germany so far. And I think the UK is kind of a bit in the middle. So I can definitely kind of relate to the credit card culture in Brazil. So where's the banking license kind of held? Is it held in the US or is it held in Brazil or?
For Nomad, you mean?
Yes.
So we don't have an own banking license. So we are using partner banks to run our business. And so we have different banks. So one is the remittance process. So how the Brazilian can send their money from Brazil to their bank account. For this, we have a partner bank who is managing the remittance process. And then we have a regulated bank in California who holds the funds, issues the cards on this. And we have by ourselves an investment advisor license, so we can really build and create the investment portfolios, but also behind we have a broker who actually has the custody behind.
That makes sense. And I mean, I guess, is there anything that you've experienced in kind of understanding the Brazilian market where it's like, oh wow, European fintechs or neobanks could really kind of learn from certain types of innovation in Brazil, I think particularly with Nubank. Is there anything that really kind of stands out in your opinion?
To be honest, from a comparison between Brazil and Europe, I see Europe is some years in front, even if the market is huge and sometimes or the amount of the people. But in terms of, for instance, open banking and these topics, Europe is some years ahead, and Brazil is kind of, I wouldn't say copying because each market is different, but you see the business models who are now going for banking as a service, for API middle layers, and all these stuff what already happened like 5 years ago in Europe, they are kind of starting now in Brazil. Of course, there are always interesting business models that are different. It's a lot around the mobile payments, so like the QR code payments. And what was really interesting, actually the most surprise for me was how advanced and proactive the central bank is. On the one side, the payment infrastructure today still, so the settlement of payments is done kind of in real time during the banking hours, while even within Germany or within European banks, the SEPA transfer can take like 2 to 2 days. Plus, also now in terms of regulation, the central bank is really, really supportive for challengers and supports fintechs, brings up new regulations, and not to protect the existing banks, like sometimes it's happened with even PSD2 in Europe. So kind of contradicting to the initial idea. The central bank is really, really supportive and created new regulations to support and boost actually the fintech environment, which we could also experience with N26.
Okay, cool. That's good to know you kind of have an engaged central bank. Okay, so I think kind of the last question is, around COVID and I guess, what's happening in Brazil. How do you see, how things are playing out impacting Nomads specifically, given it's more of a travel proposition?
Yeah, for sure. The travel topic is now, it's kind of different. But on the other side, if you follow the FX or the current real compared to the dollar to the euro, there was a high devaluation the last month. So people are even more interested to put their money out of Brazil. So while the one market is currently and hopefully just for short term shrinking, there are always new opportunities. And then we kind of also shifted our priorities towards more investment the next months until focusing on the travelers. But also we're currently talking to a lot of investors, so preparing our next funding round. Actually, from their perspective, we get very positive lights that the business model also will be interesting in the time after Corona or during Corona. So we're kind of optimistic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, for me personally, I see the next wave of successful banks taking a bit more of a niche approach and kind of really focusing on providing a range of products and services that are very targeted towards a specific audience. And I think, from what it sounds like, Nomad's definitely fulfilling that of the particular segment. So yeah, thank you so much, Garrett, for taking the time to speak to us. And we wish you all the best of luck with the launch and your trip back to Brazil.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. And we will be taking a short break.
And it's a wrap.
FinTechStage builds innovation ecosystems. We engage incumbents, investors, entrepreneurs, technology partners, and regulators to build trusted and connected fintech tribes around the world. We firmly believe that innovation in financial services will improve people's lives. Through our immersive programs, we connect global industry experts with local financial services communities to explore, challenge, and solve important issues related to fintech, regtech, insurtech, artificial intelligence, identity, and financial inclusion. The good news is that we have done it before. InnoTribe was the first and largest fintech movement worldwide, and our founders were amongst its orchestrators. We build programs with a wise combination of formats, partnerships, and content. It is experience-based, tailor-made, and proven to deliver results. Visit us at FinTechStage.com or feel free to send an email to operations@FinTechStage.com for more information.
Hey guys, welcome back to Breaking Banks Europe. Garrett gave us a little bit of perspective on neobanks, the differences between the European and the Brazilian/US ecosystem. Thanks, Meaghan, again for being with us. And we are here in the second part of the show introducing Andres Fontao, a super old friend. We go back to the InnoTribe times. Andres, is very good to have you with us. Welcome.
Hi, Matteo. How's it going? Great to hear from you. I'm very happy to be on this show.
So, Andres, of course, traditional question. Last time, you and I worked together, or at least interacted, like building ecosystems together, was with Finnovista. Now, Finnovista is certainly still there, but it grew bigger with more partners. So why don't you tell us a little bit your story?
For sure. So I'm one of the two co-founders of Finnovista, which is a company that was founded back in 2013, right, together with my business partner, Fermin Bueno. We were both living in Spain at the time. I had more recently spent time both in financial services, working for a bank, and then a large B2B fintech that ended up being acquired by a large UK software company. Fermin was in venture capital. And while we go back a long time, we reconnected professionally and started talking about fintech and a potential opportunity, right, to identify, help, accelerate, and scale transformation and disruption in the financial services industry. We started working with a large financial institution in Spain. They asked us to do some work in Latin America, first in Colombia. And that's what really, opened up our eyes to the enormous opportunity, right, that existed across Latin America, right, to first develop, build, and articulate the fintech ecosystem, right, but then start working hands-on with fintechs and with corporates, right, bringing them together, right, to help really accelerate the pace by which the financial services industry, the insurance industry, and some adjacent industries, right, can really be transformed and disrupted, right, through that perfect mix and blend, right, of entrepreneurship, of technology, and of innovation, right, and of corporate innovation. Fast forward to 2020, we're operating across the region. We have two offices. We maintain a presence in Madrid, and we have a larger office in Mexico City. We're about 15 people big in terms of organizational size. And really, again, operating across the region, identifying that best early stage fintech talent, accelerating them. And we have a partnership with Startup Bootcamp. We operate two programs across the region, a fintech accelerator and a fintech scale program. And we work with corporates, right? We work with the likes of Visa or Scotiabank, HSBC, right? And helping them really accelerate their innovation journeys from a corporate perspective.
Great. So whilst the instrument are not uncommon, right? All the corporate innovation program, the challenges, the hackathon, you name it. I think that the ecosystems are, have, their own peculiarities, right? So what is, and maybe one of them is that the access to capital needs more facilitation, I guess, right? Especially if you're early stage, I imagine, because, and the Latin American sort of ecosystem as a whole is not homogeneous either. Right? So that would be, I imagine, one of the differences that we could easily sort of spot in between the two regions. But what else? I mean, how did you feel it was like coming from, especially, a Spanish ecosystem, where everything was pretty much in place, right? As the fintech was rapidly following the big waves, and the fintech association was there, and BBVA and Santander are strong there, and so forth. So you go there, you guys sort of explore a new continent, and what happened?
Yeah. So, I think we have to look at this in different phases, right? When we first landed in Bogota and then made our way up north to Mexico City, right? Back in 2013. And you were with us, right, Matteo? You spent time with us both in Bogota and Mexico City. The concept of fintech, right, was non-existent, right? There were some startups, right, have mostly a gut feeling, right, that there was an opportunity here that they wanted to explore, but the startups were very, very early stage. Investors didn't really believe in this opportunity. The banks were basically laughing in our face, right? The regulator didn't want to be part of the conversation, right? This is 2013, right? And I would even venture to say that you had a handful of fintechs, right, operating across the region, no more, right? And that was very different, right? That was very different than what we came from, right? What we were experiencing in Madrid or in London, right, or in other startup and fintech hubs or ecosystems, right, throughout Europe. Fast forward to 2020, and of course, we're not at the level of maturity that Europe is right now, right? By no way, right? But I think by no means do we want to undervalue, right, where it's at, right? Because it's taken big steps, right? And I think what most excites me, continues to excite me today, right, is the large opportunity that exists across the region, right? And I think it's something that you're very close to in other regions, right? But it's a financial inclusion play, right? We have more than 50% of the population across the region, right? If you look at it from a standalone perspective, some markets, right, it's even greater than that, right? The population does not have access to formal financial services, right? Yet they carry technology in their pockets, right? And entrepreneurs know this, right? And so they see that through mobile technology, through big data, through other types of readily accessible technology, right, they can put credits and payments into the pockets, into the hands, right, of really a critical mass of the population, right? And so I think that's, from a market perspective, that's probably the biggest difference there is between Europe and Latin America, right? It's that untapped opportunity, right, that the banks have not wanted to or have not, really focused on in recent time, right? But that fintechs are really seeing an opportunity. Okay? Secondly, I think I would call out, and you alluded to investment, right? And yes, it's still not at the level that we're accustomed to seeing in the US or in Europe or even Asia, right? But fintech, for I think the third year in a row now, according to official data from LAFCA, from the Latin America Venture Capital Association, is that one segment, right, in venture capital investment, right, that most capital is being attracted to, right, that most attracts capital, both from domestic, regional venture capitalists, the likes of Monashis or Kazek or Inignia, right, but also international investors, right? QED Investors is very active in the region. Quona is very active in the region. Even the San Francisco VCs, the Excels and the Andres and Horowitz, right? They're starting to become more and more interested and excited specifically about fintech opportunities in the region, right? And even in, right, a time of crisis, post-COVID, right, post-corona, we're seeing that this excitement still exists, right? We're still seeing deals, we're still seeing checks signed. And I think that's a reflection of the opportunity that continues to exist, right? And I think probably in the time of crisis, right, is even more prevalent, right? And excites investors even more, right? Just to see that there is this talent, there is this technology, right, that can really leverage the opportunity to scale their businesses and become, right, a lot more attractive and a lot more profitable. So yeah, I think those are two differences that I would call out from between Europe and Latin America.
Cool. That's super interesting. So I was in Panama, I think almost 3 years ago now, for an event down there, and I met with. They claim to be the first fintech in Panama, and I was just completely shocked because you think, oh, Panama, this like banking hub and everything, and they were a small fintech that was focusing on the kind of micro lending space, mobile first, and cutting down the lending time from weeks to days. And I remember for them to be successful and gain traction, they really had to kind of lobby the regulator there. So how do you see kind of the role of the regulator in different markets in Central and South America, kind of supporting, startups in the fintech scene? And I guess what role, if you have any, in kind of lobbying the regulators?
Yeah, so we haven't had any direct role in lobbying, right? I think our role has really been to facilitate, right, and articulate the community, the ecosystem, right, and create a platform by which the regulator can come, right, and sit and talk with all the other stakeholders of the ecosystem. So we facilitated that, right, through different activities that we have done and we continue to do. We do a lot of research, right, which is commissioned by the Inter-American Development Bank, right, which is in part focused specifically on educating and lobbying the regulators and the central banks and the bank supervisors. We do our conferences, right, and the same thing, right. We create a forum. And just as a little parenthesis here, right, it's funny that you bring this up. Our first year, our first event in Mexico City, we invited the regulator to come sit on stage and be a panelist, right, in a debate that had to do with fintech regulation, right, because it's something that was already advancing, right, very high speeds, right, in other regions, right, specifically Europe, right, the UK, and we wanted, right, to get the regulator on board, right, and at least being part of the conversation, right, and the response was no response, right. They did not want to be part of this conversation, right. This is 2013, right. Fast forward again, not even to 2020, right, but fast forward to 2017, Mexico was the first country in the region to approve, right, and implement a fintech law, right, and so Mexico has become a pioneer in the sense, right. There, right, a shout out to the UK, right, the UK government through different agencies, through the Prosperity Fund, through their embassy and their Department of International Trade in Mexico, right. They've done a lot of work, right, in educating and lobbying and setting up that initial framework. But Mexico really has become a benchmark, right, for the rest of the region. The Inter-American Development Bank has done a lot of work as well. They've set up a regional work group whereby they bring together fintechs plus associations plus central bankers, right, regulators and supervisors to help keep the discussion growing, right, learn best practices and kind of guide them through the nooks and crannies, right, of designing and implementing regulatory and supervisory frameworks. Mexico, as I said, I think is the most advanced in the region, but we have seen other countries like Colombia, like Brazil, like Chile, like Argentina, right, start adopting standalone regulations, standalone work groups, right, at least to start building momentum. One last point here, Meaghan, right, which I think is hyper relevant in the world of COVID, right, that we're currently living in, right, and specifically the economic crisis, right, that has been brought on by the sanitary crisis, right, and it's that I would expect, and it's unfortunate that I haven't seen it yet, right, but I would expect now the governments and the regulators, right, to leverage their relationship with fintechs, right, to be able to channel through disbursements, right? Disbursements for SMEs, right? Mm-hmm. Or for individuals, right? Leverage the fintechs, right? Because they can do it quicker, better, and faster and cheaper. But we haven't seen this except for Colombia, right? And there, I think, Colombia has really stood out, right? And the government itself has approached the fintechs, right, to really leverage their platforms and leverage their readiness to be able to enter into these disbursement plans.
Andres, I have a question on like the incumbents ecosystem there, right? Because when we think of Latin America, if you are into banking, you immediately think of like BBVA Santander as being huge presence in the region. But at the same time, and we were talking about this in the first part of the show, there are these like huge neobanks that start having millions of clients that start making a name, right? And all of a sudden, neobank becomes a thing in Latin America as well, right? So I guess this my question has two heads. One is, since you are also like a matchmaking financial institution and startups, how do you see like local banks reacting? Are they using BBVA Santander as an inspiration, or they're like catching up with like an identity on their own on one side. And on the other side, I mean, neobanks, if you want to build a neobank, you go to Brazil, obviously, because these were critical masses. But, how is this sort of a competition to the traditional financial institutions like doing in smaller country where, maybe critical mass is not justified to like build something new, but do you see, for example, Nubank all of a sudden expanding everywhere, or there are more chances for a TransferWise or a Revolut or a number 26 come over? What would be your vision?
So a couple of questions in that question, right?
Of course.
So let's start with the neobanks. And so I think here, yes, Brazil, as we just heard from Garrett, right? Brazil, very large market, and I think first to market, right, in terms of neobanks, right? And their Nubank and Banco Neon, right? Within that, that group of neobanks, we're first to market, right? And Nubank specifically, and not to undermine, right, the other players, but Nubank really has been making a name for itself, largest bank or a neobank, right? Not only in Brazil, not only in Latin America, but I think one of the larger ones globally, if we look at it from a customer perspective, right? But Nubank has been expanding, right? They announced last year that they're launching in Mexico, right? And they're currently operating in Mexico. And, I think I'd expect to see other players, both from the region. So we have someone like Voila in Argentina, right? This is all a matter of getting to scale, right? And having enough capital to be able to get to scale. Not everybody has that capital, right? But the ones that do, so Nubank, Voila in Argentina, who got funding from SoftBank, they're the ones, right, in my mind, right, who are going to be able to grow not only in their home markets, but then also expand into other regions, right? Mexico, I think, is a little different because it does have the size and the opportunity that a Brazil warrants, right? They were just a little later to the game. Okay. And I personally, I don't understand exactly why, right? Why did Nubank launch 5 or 7 years ago in Brazil and nobody kind of, did that copycat model in Mexico, right? I'm not sure. Probably has to do with regulation. It probably has to do with the bank's response and blocking, et cetera, right? But we are getting there now, and we have, right, in our portfolio, right, but also out of portfolio, there's some very interesting neobanks, right, that are launching, that are growing, and even at more rapid pace, right, than the new banks or the Wallas are, right, in this market specifically, right. So that's one. I think that's one of the answers around what you asked in the neobanks. I do see foreigners, right. I can definitely see a Revolut or an N26, right. At least in a pre-COVID world, right. We'll have to see kind of how the economics play out, but I know there was interest and appetite on their end, right, to start exploring other markets in the region, and they would probably have to start with a Brazil and or a Mexico, right. Step 2, right? And you didn't ask this, but I'll throw in an answer, right? I see technology-based companies, right, being the real threat to existing financial institutions, right? And by that, I'm talking about an Amazon or a Mercado Libre or a Rappi, right? They have scale in terms of customers, right? They have capital, a lot of capital. They have everything. They just need a banking license, right? And with the right amount of money, they can do that, right? Either rent it or purchase it, right? So I see, right, and I think my sense is that banks feel the biggest threat coming from these large technology companies, the regional players like a Mercado Libre and a Rappi, but even the international players, right? Potentially like an Amazon or a PayPal. How have the banks been responding, right? And here, I'll focus more on Mexico, but I think in Latin America in general, and Mexico specifically, I think you have different sets and groups of banks, right? You have the large international players, right? So in Mexico, top 4, top 5 banks, you have BBVA, you have Citibanamex, which is part of Citibank, you have Santander, you have Banorte, right, which is kind of the only true national player, but you get a large bank, right? Then you have kind of your medium regional players, right? So someone like Scotiabank, someone like HSBC, who despite being global banks, right, their presence and their coverage in the country and in the region, right, is not as widespread as a BBVA or a Santander, right? And then you have the local players, right? You have your local banks, right? 100% domestic, medium to small size banks, right? But those are the ones that, I think can most quickly, right? Because a lot of them are family-owned businesses, because decisions can be made a lot quicker, right? And especially as younger blood is brought into their boards, right? They're the ones that are actually moving a lot quicker and a lot nimbler, right? So I call out someone like Banregio in Mexico, or someone, not the same size, but I think someone like Bancolombia in Colombia, right? There are banks that, despite their size, right? Then again, Banregio and Bancolombia are not comparable, but just the way that they're organized and they're structured, right? They can make decisions a lot quicker and they can be a lot more aggressive, right? But to circle back to your initial question, a lot of them do look up first to BBVA and to Santander and say, okay, what are these guys doing, right? They try to understand why are they doing it, right? The good thing is that they don't copycat, right? I think they're smart enough to say, okay, I know what worked and I know what didn't work for BBVA and Santander, right? And so I can avoid those $100 million mistakes and to then go ahead and do something, right, which will be more impactful, will be more transformative, right? Will be more disruptive for my market, for my segment, for my clients.
Cool. I think you just gave us the playbook on how to succeed in Central and South America. So I'm sure our listeners will thank you very much for that. One last question for me. So I think what we've been seeing a lot in terms of kind of the fintech scene in Europe and North America is kind of, I feel like, the younger generation and millennials are really looking for, sustainable, green, ethical solutions. Is this the case in kind of South and Latin America? Do you see this as kind of a global phenomenon, or is it more confined to these parts? Because I think there's going to be a huge kind of wave of this in the medium to long term.
So there are movements, but they're not regional, right? They're global, right? I mean, the UN is pushing, right, on green finance and sustainability. It's part of the SDGs. Unfortunately, in Latin America, right, the maturity of the ecosystem, right, and I include the banks here, right, is not focused on environmental sustainability, right? I can see it going in that direction, but I'll refer back to that data point that I mentioned at the beginning, right? When more than 50% of the population is unbanked, another percentage is underbanked, right? I think I think that the focus is on other parts, right? And the focus, I think, step one is just getting to a base layer of education and access of the financial services. I would expect, right, that sustainability, right, becomes a more prevalent theme in financial services across the region, and I would hope that's the fintechs, right, who I think are more, at least a generation, right, of entrepreneurs, right, of younger entrepreneurs are more sensitive to these issues, right. So maybe if it follows the same trends that have been followed in other regions, right, well, I would expect maybe 3 to 5 years, right, just to be able to be talking about green finance and sustainability in a more coherent and structured manner as it relates to fintech.
Thank you, Andres. Maybe just a super last mention to you mentioned COVID and the fact that of course no one really knows what the ultimate impact will be, but what maybe would be nice to share in a couple of sentences is what's your perception, of the different ecosystems? And, we got the, a sort of a glimpse on Brazil, but, very few know and are so close as you are to the Mexican and the other sort of, different fintech hubs. Looks like, the situation is far from being solved, but that's the European look. Would you confirm that?
Yeah, I think you look at the global newspapers, right? Mexico, Brazil, Peru, other countries, right? Despite some of them, not all, despite some of them, taking very drastic measures early on, right? The numbers are still increasing, and they're still increasing, and they're still increasing, right? And I think, unfortunately, that's a consequence, right, of the poor infrastructure, among other things, right, that exists in the region. And I think a collateral effect, like in any other country, in any other market, right, will be the economic crisis that hits, right? But I think in Latin America, it's going to be noticed. It's going to be felt even harder, right? A country, like the United States, or a region like Europe, right, will be able to rebound a lot quicker. I would call out, though, the resilience in the Mexicans, in the Latin Americans, right? I mean, they're no stranger to crises, right? So that again, shouldn't scare anybody. With the right measures, right, put in place, and with that resilience, right, of this new generation of entrepreneurs, right, we should be able to get out of, and weather this crisis, right, and come out in a much stronger position. As it relates to fintech, I think nobody questions that this is the opportunity for fintech to shine, and again, it's to help individuals and it's to help SMEs, right, weather that crisis, right, and come out stronger as individuals and as companies, right, and be in a better financial position than when we started the crisis. We've already started to see this, and I'll refer back to banks, right? The banks themselves, right? They've and I know I'm now going on more than a couple words, but banks have accelerated their transformation processes, right? Things that they were planning on doing in the next 3 to 5 years have now been done in weeks, right? Just because of a necessity and a demand from their clients. And so the quicker that fintechs and banks, right, can respond to this, right, I think the better off the region is going to be, right? And then the individuals and the companies that make up the region.
I knew, Andres, that you would end it up on a positive note because we know each other long enough to share the spirit of opportunities rather than sort of standing still on the problem. Andres, thank you very much. That was actually both. It was a business catch up. Now let's have a personal one on our, on the last years that we have not been talking, but it was actually a great pleasure to hear how Finnovista has grown. And thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you, Meaghan.
Guys, thanks for being with us on this Outside In episode on Latin America. That's Breaking Banks Europe show, and it's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Banks Europe, a Provoke Media podcast in cooperation with FinTechStage. Don't forget to tweet us out, shout out, or post to the team at Breaking Banks EU on Twitter. If there's something or someone you'd like to hear on our cast, let us know. See you next week on Breaking Banks Europe.